The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room descended into a charged silence as Governor Ron DeSantis leaned forward toward his microphone, a polished confidence radiating from the slight curve of his smile. For nearly 15 minutes he had constructed a detailed, almost prosecutorial argument against Representative Jasmine Crockett's proposed federal voting rights legislation, layering constitutional citations, invoking state sovereignty, and presenting statistical evidence that seemed designed to dismantle her central premise piece by piece. Representative Crockett, DeSantis began, his voice firm yet measured, carrying through the expansive chamber. Your legislation would effectively federalize election procedures that the Constitution explicitly reserves to the states. Before we continue this discussion, I'd like to ask you directly, can you identify even a single provision in your own state's election code that prevents a lawful voter from casting a ballot? A ripple of tension swept through the room. Committee members exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Everyone recognized the trap DeSantis had just laid, a calculated move meant to corner his opponent with her own logic. For 3 long seconds, Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still. Her expression was unreadable, her posture deliberate, composed but coiled, like someone weighing not whether to strike, but how precisely to do it. Then she reached for her microphone, her voice smooth as tempered steel. "Governor," she said evenly, "I have before me the transcript of your sworn testimony in Davis v. Florida from last year, in which you stated under oath that certain provisions in your state's own election law could, in fact, prevent eligible citizens from voting. Would you like me to read your exact words to this committee?" DeSantis's smile froze mid-expression. Whispered reactions rippled through the rows behind him as cameras zoomed in to capture the moment. What followed would ignite a national reckoning over voting rights and the boundaries of executive power, one that would be replayed on every major network before the day was out. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, comment where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss the rest of this political showdown. Representative Jasmine Crockett had, in a remarkably short time, become one of the most formidable legal minds in Congress. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center and a former civil rights attorney, she had built her career defending marginalized communities against systemic barriers to the ballot box. At just 42, she had already argued 3 major cases before federal appellate courts, earning a reputation for surgical precision and composure under pressure. Her proposed Federal Voter Protection Act was the culmination of nearly a decade of research and advocacy. Unlike earlier, broader attempts at election reform, Crockett's bill was narrowly tailored, meticulously crafted to survive constitutional scrutiny. It focused on removing obstacles that disproportionately affected poor and minority voters, while still respecting legitimate state interests in election security. "This isn't about partisan advantage," she had said when introducing the bill. "It's about ensuring that every eligible American can exercise their constitutional right to vote, without facing unnecessary hurdles or intimidation." Across the aisle, Governor Ron DeSantis had spent years cultivating his image as a staunch defender of state sovereignty and election integrity. A Harvard Law graduate and former naval officer, he had enacted some of the country's strictest election measures, insisting they were essential to safeguard democracy, despite the absence of any widespread fraud. Recently, he had launched a national initiative called Secure State Elections, partnering with like-minded governors to resist what he called federal interference in local governance. His appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee that morning was calculated to showcase leadership, and perhaps to test the waters of national ambition. The ideological clash between Crockett and DeSantis wasn't just political theater. It embodied one of the oldest debates in American constitutional history. Where does state authority end? And where does federal responsibility to protect fundamental rights begin? Tension between them had simmered for months. When Crockett first introduced her bill, DeSantis publicly dismissed it as unconstitutional federal intrusion. She responded sharply, quoting Supreme Court precedent affirming Congress's power to regulate federal elections and enforce constitutional amendments protecting voting rights. Their back and forth became a recurring headline, a modern echo of the historic conflicts between civil rights advocates and defenders of states' rights. What few in the chamber knew was that Crockett had obtained and thoroughly reviewed DeSantis's deposition from the Davis v. Florida lawsuit, a detail that would soon prove pivotal. The governor, expecting a conventional policy debate, had walked into a constitutional ambush. At precisely 10 a.m., Chairman Sheldon Whitehouse called the hearing to order. Today's session will consider SB 2771, the Federal Voter Protection Act, sponsored by Representative Jasmine Crockett, he announced. Our first witness is Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. DeSantis approached the witness table with deliberate composure, stacking his notes and arranging his charts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, he began. I appear before this committee to express grave concerns about legislation that would fundamentally alter the delicate constitutional balance between state and federal authority over elections. For 15 uninterrupted minutes, DeSantis delivered a polished critique, methodical, confident, and steeped in legal references. He invoked Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, cited Federalist Papers, and warned against federal overreach. The Constitution entrusts states with primary responsibility for administering elections, he argued. That's not an accident. States are laboratories of democracy, responsive to their local realities. Federal uniformity would flatten that diversity and erode accountability. He gestured toward a series of color-coded charts projected behind him. In Florida, after we implemented election integrity reforms, turnout actually increased across all demographic groups. These facts directly contradict the premise of Representative Crockett's bill. Republican members nodded approvingly, impressed by the clarity and poise of his presentation. It was, to that point, a masterclass in controlled political theater. When the floor opened for questioning, friendly senators tossed him softballs, allowing DeSantis to expand on his defense of state control. Then came the pivot. Representative Crockett, Chairman Whitehouse said, "You are recognized for questioning." Crockett adjusted her microphone, her expression calm, her voice steady but edged with purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began. Turning toward DeSantis, she offered a polite nod. "Governor, thank you for your testimony. Happy to be here." "Representative," DeSantis replied smoothly. "Governor," Crockett said, "you've emphasized the sanctity of state sovereignty in administering elections. Would you agree, however, that such sovereignty is not absolute, that it must still operate within the boundaries of constitutional guarantees?" DeSantis hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Of course, states must respect constitutional principles, including equal protection." "My point exactly," Crockett continued. "And yet, you also argue that the Constitution grants states near-exclusive authority to manage their elections, including determining eligibility and procedural rules. Is that accurate?" "Within reason," DeSantis answered carefully. "States may establish reasonable regulations, subject to constitutional review." "And who determines what's reasonable?" Crockett asked. "Ultimately the courts," DeSantis replied, his tone firm but cautious. "But the presumption should favor state authority." Crockett smiled faintly. "Let's explore that presumption. You testified that Florida's election integrity measures increased participation across all demographics. Which specific measures are you referring to?" DeSantis brightened slightly. "We implemented voter ID laws, restricted ballot harvesting, improved voter roll accuracy, and enhanced ballot chain of custody standards. And as I stated, turnout rose, including among minority voters." Crockett tilted her head. "Governor, are you familiar with the term correlation versus causation?" A flicker of irritation crossed DeSantis's face. "Of course, it's a basic principle of statistical analysis." "So you acknowledge," Crockett pressed, "that higher turnout could be influenced by other factors, like voter mobilization efforts or heightened political engagement?" "Multiple factors always contribute," DeSantis conceded. "But the key takeaway remains. Our laws did not suppress lawful voting." Crockett nodded slowly. "Governor, you're a Harvard-trained attorney. You understand that constitutional rights don't depend on majority convenience. Even if 99% of citizens can exercise a right freely, denying that right to the remaining 1% is still unconstitutional. Correct?" DeSantis's posture stiffened. "Yes, Representative. Constitutional rights must apply universally." "Good," she said, her tone sharpening just slightly. "Then allow me to ask you directly. Can you state, under oath, that every eligible voter in Florida can cast a ballot without facing substantial obstacles under your current laws?" The air in the room thickened. DeSantis paused, aware that a firm yes might contradict his previous testimony in Davis v. Florida, while a no would undercut his defense of Florida's system. "Our laws," he said finally, "create a process that is both accessible and secure. Any eligible voter who makes reasonable efforts can successfully cast a ballot." Crockett leaned forward slightly. "Reasonable efforts," she repeated, her voice even, but cutting through the air like a scalpel. "That's an interesting qualification. Let's explore what you consider reasonable." She opened a folder on her desk. "Governor, I have here the transcript of your deposition in Davis versus Florida, taken on March 14th, last year. Are you familiar with this case? Dantis's expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes that only experienced observers would notice. I'm familiar with the case. Yes. During this deposition, you were questioned about specific provisions in Florida's election laws and their potential impacts. You were under oath at the time, correct? Yes, as I am today, Dantis replied, his tone slightly defensive. On page 142 of this transcript, Crockett continued. You were asked about voters in rural counties' HOLAC DMB offices for obtaining state-issued IDs. The attorney asked if you acknowledged that such voters face greater burdens in obtaining required identification. According to this transcript, you responded, and I quote, "Yes. Certain voters may face greater challenges depending on their circumstances. That's an unfortunate reality of any regulatory system." She looked up from the transcript. Is that an accurate representation of your testimony, Governor? Dantis paused briefly. Context matters. Representative. I was acknowledging that no system is perfect, but let me continue. Crockett interjected calmly. On page 157, you were asked if Florida's restriction on providing water to voters in line could potentially force elderly or disabled voters to abandon their attempt to vote on hot Florida days. According to this transcript, you stated in extreme cases that could potentially occur, but such instances would be rare. She turned to page. On page 201, you acknowledged that the reduction in drop boxes might create additional difficulties for voters with non-traditional work schedules or transportation limitations. Crockett looked up from the transcript. Governor, in sworn testimony, you acknowledged that specific provisions of Florida's election laws could prevent eligible citizens from voting under certain circumstances. Yet today, you've characterized these same laws as creating no obstacles to voting. How do you reconcile these contradictory positions? The room fell silent. Committee members leaned forward. Reporters typed frantically. Dantis, normally quick and confident, took several seconds to formulate his response. Representative Crockett, you're conflating acknowledgement of theoretical edge cases with actual voter suppression. In any regulatory system, perfect implementation is impossible. What matters is the overall effect, which the data clearly shows as positive. Crockett nodded slightly. So you acknowledge that your laws do create obstacles that prevent some eligible citizens from voting. I acknowledge that no system is perfect, Dantis replied, his frustration becoming more visible. But these isolated examples don't justify federal takeover of state election systems. Let's be clear, Governor Crockett pressed. This isn't about perfection or isolated examples. This is about American citizens being denied their constitutional right to vote because of laws you've championed and defended. You acknowledge this reality under oath in one context, but deny it in another when it doesn't suit your political narrative. She closed the folder deliberately. My final question is simple. Governor, which testimony should this committee believe, your sworn statements acknowledging that your laws create barriers to voting, or your current testimony suggesting they don't? Dantis's face flushed slightly. Representative, you're mischaracterizing my testimony in both instances. I've consistently maintained that our laws balance accessibility and security, even if imperfect in theoretical edge cases. Theoretical to whom, Governor? Crockett asked, her voice steady but penetrating. To the disabled veteran who can't stand in line for hours. To the rural voter who must travel 50 miles to obtain ID. To the essential worker who can't reach a polling place during reduced early voting hours. Are their constitutional rights merely theoretical edge cases? Before Dantis could respond, Crockett continued. The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of Americans who are convenient to accommodate, Governor. It protects all Americans, including those you've admitted are burdened by your laws. The confrontation had shifted from abstract constitutional theory to concrete human impact, precisely the ground Crockett had intended to fight on all along. As Crockett's questioning continued, she methodically presented evidence that transformed the hearing from a theoretical debate into a powerful examination of real-world consequences. Governor, she continued, I have here affidavit from 7 Florida voters collected during the Davis litigation. She held up a document. Mary Wilson, a 78-year-old voter from Gadsden County, had to travel 67 miles round-trip to obtain an acceptable ID, after the one she'd used for decades was deemed insufficient under your new laws. She doesn't drive and had to pay someone $120 to take her nearly a week's grocery budget on her fixed income. Crockett looked up from the document. Is Miss Wilson's constitutional right to vote what you consider a theoretical edge case? DeSantis shifted in his chair. Individual anecdotes don't establish systemic problems. Our laws provide reasonable accommodations. James Hernandez Crockett continued, holding up another affidavit. A paramedic who works 12-hour shifts previously voted at a drop box near his workplace. After your legislation reduced drop-box locations and limited their hours to government business hours only, he was unable to vote in the last election because his shift schedule didn't allow him to reach a polling place during open hours. She placed the affidavit down deliberately. Governor, these aren't anecdotes. They're American citizens being denied their constitutional rights by design, not by accident. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. What began as a theoretical constitutional debate had become a stark examination of human impact. Several committee members who'd initially seemed sympathetic to DeSantis now appeared uncomfortable. Representative, DeSantis responded, his tone more defensive. These individual challenges don't justify federal intervention. States have legitimate interests in maintaining election integrity. Let's discuss election integrity, Crockett interjected. She held up another document. This is the Florida Division of Elections owned data on voter fraud cases from 2000 to 2023. In 23 years and more than 50 million ballots cast, Florida has documented exactly 153 cases of actual voter fraud. 0.0003% of all votes. Many of these cases were administrative errors rather than deliberate fraud. She looked directly at DeSantis. Governor, you've justified restrictions that by your own sworn testimony prevent eligible citizens from voting, all to address a problem that your own state's data shows barely exists. DeSantis attempted Torrigan control of the narrative. Representative. Even one fraudulent vote undermines, even one citizen wrongly denied their constitutional right to vote undermines democracy. Crockett countered immediately. The difference is, by your own data and testimony, your laws have prevented thousands of eligible citizens from voting, to potentially stop a handful of fraudulent votes. She picked up the Davis transcript again. Governor, on page 276 of your deposition, you were asked if you could quantify how many fraudulent votes your new measures had prevented. Your answer under oath was no. We cannot provide specific numbers on prevention as such figures would be speculative. Crockett placed the transcript down. So be your own admission, you cannot demonstrate that these laws prevent fraud, but you've acknowledged they prevent eligible citizens from voting. How is that a reasonable balance of interests? For the first time, DeSantis appeared genuinely unsettled. His typical confident demeanor had given way to visible discomfort. Representative, election integrity encompasses more than just preventing documented fraud cases. It's about maintaining voter confidence in the system. Voter confidence, Crockett repeated thoughtfully. Governor, I have here polling data from the Florida Secretary of State's office. She held up another document. Before your new election laws, 79% of Florida voters expressed confidence in the election system. After implementation, that figure dropped to 71%. Confidence decreased, not increased after your integrity measures. The revelation hung in the air. A murmur spread through the gallery as reporters frantically updated their stories. What had begun as DeSantis' opportunity to showcase his constitutional expertise had become an increasingly difficult defensive battle. Chairman Whitehouse intervened. Their representative's time has expired. Governor, you may respond briefly to the last question. DeSantis attempted to recover. Polling fluctuates based on numerous factors. The fundamental point remains that states, not the federal government, have constitutional authority over election procedures. Crockett requested an additional minute, which the chairman granted. Governor, she said, her tone shifting slightly. This isn't about federal versus state power. This is about the Constitution versus laws that violate its guarantees. You've acknowledged, under oath, that your laws create barriers that prevent eligible Americans from voting. The question isn't whether states have authority over elections. They clearly do. The question is whether that authority includes the power to enact barriers that deny constitutional rights to certain citizens. She leaned forward slightly. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on race. The 26th protects voters over age 18. The 19th protects women voters. And the 14th guarantees equal protection to all citizens. My bill doesn't federalize elections. It simply ensures state election laws comply with these constitutional guarantees. Looking directly at DeSantis, she delivered her final point. Governor, you took an oath to the Constitution, not to a theory of state sovereignty that lets you decide whose votes matter. By your own admission, your laws have denied eligible Americans their constitutional rights. That's not a reasonable regulation. It's precisely what the Constitution forbids. The room fell silent. DeSantis, normally quick with responses, seemed momentarily without words. Several committee members exchanged glances, recognizing they had witnessed something rare in modern politics. A substantive exchange that cut through talking points to the fundamental constitutional principles at stake. For journalists covering the hearing, the story had completely transformed. What was expected to be a routine partisan clash had become a masterclass in constitutional oversight and accountability. By evening, the confrontation between Representative Crockett and Governor DeSantis dominated political coverage across the media landscape. Video clips of the exchanges spread rapidly across social media platforms, with Crockett's methodical dismantling of DeSantis's position drawing particular attention. The Washington Post's headline captured the general sentiment. Crockett uses DeSantis's own words to expose contradictions on voting rights. The accompanying analysis noted that what made the exchange extraordinary wasn't partisan theatrics, but Crockett's lawyer-like precision in using DeSantis's sworn testimony to undermine his current claims. Traditionally conservative outlets acknowledged the effectiveness of Crockett's approach. The National Review published an analysis titled "A Lesson in Constitutional Preparation," noting that, regardless of one's position on federalism, Representative Crockett's methodical use of evidence and focus on constitutional fundamentals rather than partisan talking points deserve study. For DeSantis, the aftermath required careful navigation. Initially, his team attempted to dismiss the exchange as political theater. But this approach gained little traction as more people watched the full confrontation. The governor had been challenged not with partisan accusations, but with his own words under oath. 3 days after the hearing, DeSantis appeared on a friendly cable news program to offer a more nuanced response. "I stand by Florida's election integrity measures," he stated, "but I acknowledge that we must continue improving implementation to ensure all eligible voters can participate." Representative Crockett raised some points worthy of consideration, though I still fundamentally disagree with federal legislation in this area. This moderate response surprised many political observers accustomed to more combative rhetoric. A political scientist from the University of Virginia noted, "When a skilled politician like DeSantis adopts a conciliatory tone, it's recognition that the previous confrontation didn't go as planned. He's cutting his losses and attempting to reframe the narrative." For Crockett, the aftermath brought heightened national attention to both her proposed legislation and her approach to constitutional oversight. Law schools requested permission to use video of the exchange in classes on constitutional law and legislative process. The American Bar Association invited her to deliver the keynote address at its annual conference on voting rights. In a rare moment of bipartisanship, 3 Republican senators approached Crockett privately to discuss potential modifications to her bill that might address legitimate state concerns while maintaining constitutional protections. "We were impressed by your focus on the Constitution rather than partisanship," one senator reportedly told her. "That opens the door to actual dialogue." Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation sparked a broader national conversation about the relationship between constitutional rights and election procedures. Editorial boards across the country published thoughtful analyses examining the tension between state authority and federal responsibility to protect constitutional guarantees. Representative Crockett's questioning exposed a fundamental contradiction in contemporary federalism debates, wrote a constitutional scholar in The Atlantic. "We cannot simultaneously claim devotion to the Constitution and defend laws that, by their architect's own admission, deny constitutional rights to certain citizens." 6 months after the confrontation, its impact continued to resonate. When Florida's legislature reconvened, it passed modest but meaningful reforms to address some of the barriers Crockett had highlighted, including expanded ID options for elderly voters and extended hours for drop boxes. While DeSantis never publicly connected these changes to the congressional hearing, political observers recognized them as a tacit acknowledgement of vulnerabilities Crockett had exposed. The legislative impact extended beyond Florida. Several states reviewing their election laws began explicitly incorporating accessibility impact assessments to evaluate how new regulations might affect different voting populations. A bipartisan group of election officials formed the Accessible Democracy Initiative, dedicated to identifying and removing barriers that disproportionately affected vulnerable communities. Crockett's original bill underwent several revisions, incorporating suggestions from both Democratic and Republican legislators. The modified version maintained core constitutional protections, while providing states greater flexibility in implementation. This approach garnered support from moderate members of both parties, creating a viable path to passage that few had thought possible before the Dantis confrontation. For legal scholars, the Crockett-Dantis exchange became a case study in effective constitutional oversight. What made this confrontation historic wasn't partisan scoring of points, explained a professor at Georgetown Law. It was Representative Crockett's focus on fundamental constitutional principles, rather than political advantage. She forced a reckoning with the gap between stated principles and actual impacts. 3 years later, when another major voting rights case reached the Supreme Court, multiple justices referenced the evidence presented during the Crockett-Dantis exchange in their opinions. The majority opinion quoted Crockett directly. "The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of Americans who are convenient to accommodate. It protects all Americans." For ordinary citizens, the confrontation offered a rare moment of clarity in an often confusing political landscape. A retired teacher in Ohio expressed what many felt: "I wasn't sure what to think about all these voting laws before, but watching Representative Crockett focusing, real people being denied their right to vote and using Governor Dantis' own words to prove it, that made things clear for me. This isn't about politics, it's about whether we truly believe everyone's vote matters." As for the personal impact on both figures, Dantis emerged more cautious, but perhaps wiser in his approach to constitutional questions. In subsequent appearances, he voided absolute claims about election laws and acknowledged the need for continuous improvement to ensure accessibility. This more nuanced approach, while less dramatic, ultimately strengthened his credibility with moderate voters. Crockett, meanwhile, continued her methodical, evidence-based approach to oversight, resisting pressure to adopt a more partisan or inflammatory style despite her new national profile. "My job isn't to create viral moments," she explained in a rare interview. "My job is to ensure our laws fulfill constitutional promises to all Americans. That requires evidence, preparation, and focus on principles rather than personalities." The lasting legacy of the confrontation wasn't a political victory for either side, but a reminder that the most powerful oversight comes not from partisan attacks, but from methodical exposure of the gap between stated principles and demonstrated actions. In an era often dominated by theatrical politics, the Crockett-Dantis exchange offered a glimpse of substantive constitutional debate that transcended traditional partisan divisions. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important constitutional debates. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the balance between state authority and constitutional protections in our election systems.